everyone, I'm Nitahone, and every time a new set is spoiled, I do a bunch of videos on the upcoming limited format. So far, I've reviewed every card in Core Set 2019 and talked about my picks for the biggest bombs in the format. In this video, I'm going to talk about the archetypes in this new format. Instead of just talking about the cards in a vacuum, I'm going to talk about how they interact. Each two-color combination has specific synergies, and in this video, we'll talk about what each color pair is really trying to do in the format. In this video, I'm going to talk about specific cards that either fulfill or push you towards certain synergies within a color pair. This means I'm not going to be talking about cards that are just good in any deck, like removal spells, unless they have some specific synergy with a color pair. If you want to see me talk about that stuff, you can check out my set review, as well as the video that will be coming out tomorrow on the best commons and uncommons in this set. Alright, let's jump into our first color pair. First up, we have blue-white. Our blue-white signpost uncommon, and a signpost uncommon is, as you may have guessed, an uncommon that takes up two colors. It's a two-color card, a gold card, and its goal is to sort of, A, be pretty powerful if you fulfill certain synergies, and B, let you know what a specific color pair is interested in doing. And Aerial Engineer wants you to play artifacts. If you don't play artifacts, it's a really mediocre card. If you do have artifacts, well, it gets to be a 4-mana 4/4 flyer, which is great. So let's look at now the common and uncommon cards within blue-white that give you a payoff for running artifacts. We of course have Aerial Engineer, but we also have Ether Shield Artificer, who specifically wants you to be running artifact creatures, so that's something to keep in mind with the Artificer. The other artifact payoffs aren't as specific. The Artificer is the only one that says artifact creatures. The others don't care what kind of artifact it is. So it does push you a little more towards artifact creatures, and keep that in mind. Trusty Pack Beast is another nice little payoff for running artifacts. It lets you return one from your graveyard to your hand. Gearsmith Prodigy just is a 1-mana 2/2 if you have artifacts. Scholar of Stars is a nice payoff because it draws you a card if you have an artifact. And Skilled Animator is nice too because it turns any artifact you have into a 5/5. And with Skilled Animator, it's sort of the reverse of the Artificer. The Skilled Animator almost wants you to not be playing artifact creatures as much, because if you're turning like a Manalith into a 5/5, that's way better than turning like your 2/2 or 3/3 artifact creature into a 5/5, because you're getting more total power and toughness out of the boost. But any artifact will work. There's also Gearsmith Guardian, who isn't exactly an artifact payoff, but he's an artifact who wants you to be playing blue creatures, and so he fits really well into this deck, because he's an artifact and he wants you to be playing blue creatures. Let's look at other artifacts at common and uncommon that are well suited for this deck, because hey, you want to have artifacts. So we've got Diamond Mare. It's an artifact creature, and that's nice for the Artificer. It's nothing incredibly special, but it's a solid card, and the fact that it's an artifact makes it all the more attractive to this deck. Arcane Encyclopedia, I almost feel like this is the only deck that wants it because it's so mediocre. It's just so much mana to draw a card, and yeah, it'd be good in a really grindy game, but I think it'll be better in this deck because just controlling one artifact is all you need for all those synergies. Explosive Apparatus is sort of the same thing. It's definitely going to be better in a deck that cares about artifacts because it's not that great of a card on its own. Gargoyle Sentinel is a fine card on its own, so you may be competing with other people to take those. Meteor Golem's a 7-drop, so he's not the greatest in terms of setting you up for artifact synergies in the early game, but he is an artifact, and he's a really strong one. Skyscanner I like a lot. It gives you one little artifact in play, it draws you a card, it happens to have flying, and so it can attack. Suspicious Bookcase is a nice little artifact creature who can block okay and make your guys unblockable when you need it to. Manalith is nice because it provides fixing, while also, hey, being an artifact for your blue-white artifact deck. Aviation Pioneer, not an artifact itself, but it does make a Thopter token, and for that reason, this is the deck it's best suited for, although, it's a great common in any deck, to be fair. All right, so those are the commons and uncommons that sort of push you towards a blue-white artifact deck. The deck really only asks you to have like one artifact in play. It doesn't really check for a bunch more than that usually, so your artifact requirements aren't like insane. I think if you have 5 or 6, your deck's going to be pretty good. More is better, of course, but there aren't a ton of super powerful artifacts in this set, at least at the lower rarities, so pushing it to get to a really high level of artifacts may not be worth it. But let's look at the rares in blue and white that are well suited for this deck. So, of course, you have Psy Master Thopterist, who is insane. He is a reason that you want to be playing like 10 artifacts because he makes every artifact spell you play create a 1/1 Thopter. He can also sacrifice artifacts to draw you cards. I actually think he's first pickable because he has an incredibly high ceiling. So, this is one way you end up in this deck is by first picking Psy and then saying, all right, I guess I'm going to take as many artifacts as I can, and, you happen to pick up some other synergies. One with the Machine I don't love. it's just too erratic. The chances of drawing more than 2 cards or 3 cards with it aren't great. And granted, drawing 3 with it's nice, but you still have to take into account the fact that sometimes it will draw you nothing. Still, if there's any deck for one at the machine, this is it. Tezzeret, Artifice Master, I have him here. He's good in any deck, though. You're not going to see him unless you first pick him. I do just have him here because he is better in an artifact deck because his 0 ability asks you to control as many artifacts as possible. Chaos Wand is another card that's good in any deck, I think. Lets you cast spells out of your opponent's deck. I think that seems nice. It will be a little better here because you want to control artifacts. Dragon's Horde is basically an upgraded Manolith. It's a Manolith that can draw you a card, and hey, maybe you have some dragons too. Sigiled Sword of Valoron is a nice piece of equipment. Happens to be an artifact, so that's nice. Transmogrifying Wand, I guess Chaos Wand and Transmogrifying Wand sort of go together. It's not as good as Chaos Wand, but it seems like a reasonable card to me. I think the typical thing you can do with it is turn your opponent's 5/5 flyer into a 2/4 or whatever, and that's going to feel pretty good. Just shutting down creatures with it will feel good. And while it sits on the battlefield waiting to find a creature to shut down, it can help you with all your artifact synergies. So that's blue-white. You want to be running artifacts. You have some powerful payoffs for it, and I think that's pretty much the identity of this deck. You want to be an artifact deck. Let's move on to our next color pair, which is black-red, where our signpost uncommon is Brawl Bash Ogre. So he's only a 4-mana 3/3 with Menace, but when he attacks, you get to sacrifice a creature if you want to, and if you do, he gets +2/+2, and that's nice. So the black-red color pair, what Brawl Bash Ogre is trying to tell us, the black-red color pair is all about sacrificing stuff. Which is a pretty classic thing for the black-red color pair throughout Magic's history. So let's look at the cards that have you sacrifice things. So we have Brawl Bash Ogre, of course. There's also Blood Divination, which is nice. I mean, you have to have a creature worth sacrificing, and we're going to get to that in a second, the creatures you want to be sacrificing in this color pair. But Blood Divination, if you're sacrificing something that gives you value, it can be pretty ridiculous. Ravenous Harpy can turn your whole board into counters. Thud sacrifices a creature as well, though I think it's less of a focus of Thud. I think Thud's going to be better with just big creatures than it is sacrificing things. So as you can see, there's actually, while this color pair is sort of about sacrificing, all the cards involved with the sacrifice element of the cards anyway are uncommon. And that does make it a little hard for the deck to work out. Though to be fair, no one is going to want Blood Divination, and maybe not even Ravenous Harpy, unless they're in this color pair. Same with Brawl Bash Ogre, obviously. So what are the cards you want to be sacrificing? Well, you want to be using Act of Treason to steal your opponent's creatures, ideally. That's the most broken thing you can do with these effects. Like, steal your opponent's creature, attack with Brawl Bash Ogre, and sacrifice it. That way, you kill their creature and get a bonus out of it. There's also stuff like Dragon Egg, which leaves behind a 2/2 dragon when it dies. There's also Goblin Instigator, who brings you 2 bodies to sacrifice. There's also Reassembling Skeleton, who just keeps reassembling himself and getting ready to be sacrificed all over again. There's Doomed Dissenter, who leaves behind a 2/2 zombie as well. So, the black-red deck, I think, will have sort of a sacrifice sub-theme. I don't think it's pushed hard enough for it to really be all about sacrificing. I think it'll mostly be a deck with good removal that can do some silly things with sacrificing. There are some rares that push you towards sacrificing as well. Stuff like Demon of Catastrophes. Just imagine sacrificing a Dragon Egg to that. I hope I get to do that in this format. Graveyard Marshal, which is nice because you're stocking your graveyard with sacrificed creatures. He can turn them into zombies. Isareth, which is nice because, again, you're filling your graveyard with creatures and she can bring them back. Open the Graves is nice because every creature you sacrifice leaves behind another body. And Dark Dweller Oracle is another card that lets you sacrifice stuff for a pretty nice activated ability. So, there's a sacrifice sub-theme here. Don't see it being something you can just do every time you draft black-red, but you'll be able to do it sometimes. So let's move on to the next color pair, which is red-green, where our signpost uncommon is Draconic Disciple. Between his ability to add mana of any color to your mana pool and his ability to turn into a huge dragon in the late game for 7 mana, this color pair is pushing you towards sort of 2 different things, but they're related. One of them is that you want to be ramping, and the other is that you want to be playing monsters. In other words, big things you're curving into, and to a lesser extent, this color pair wants you to be in dragons. There aren't exactly a lot of dragon synergies in this set, but there are a few, and so this color pair is the best one really for dragons, between its ability to ramp and its ability to splash and its ability to have a few high power synergies, which we'll talk about. First, let's talk about the ramp in this color pair. We of course have our Disciple. We also have Druid of the Cowl. We have Elvish Rejuvenator. Gift of Paradise, which I think is especially good because of its ability to add mana of any color, 2 mana of any color, so you can splash. And even red has a ramp spell for us in Catalyst Elemental, a ramp creature, I should say. You'd have to give it up, but if you can ramp into a dragon with it on like turn 4, that's pretty nuts. There's Manalith, which can add mana of any color. So you got a lot of ramping at common, which makes it so that this deck isn't that hard to make into a ramp deck. There's also a sub-theme within this color pair of high power that Colossal Majesty really embodies, but Thud and Rabid Bite both are better the higher your creature's power is. Colossal Majesty wants you to control creatures with power 4 or greater, and if you do, it gets to be out of control. So let's look at the monsters, some of the stuff you want to be ramping into. So you've got Colossal Dreadmaw, of course. You have Ghastbark Twins. These are all things that if you can play them early, can just take over a game. Vigilant Baloth. Siegebreaker Giant's nice, not only because he's huge, but also because he makes it so creatures can't block. Spark Tongue Dragon, there's a dragon for you. This is the only color pair that has dragons at common and uncommon. All the other color pairs only have them at higher rarities or not at all. So that's something to keep in mind about this color pair. This is the best color pair for the various dragon synergies that are at higher rarities. There's also Volcanic Dragon. And Meteor Golem, and these are all things that you want to be ramping into and playing early and just sort of crushing your opponent with them. So this color pair is also the best at splashing. Between having Gift of Paradise and things like that, it's going to be better at splashing the most colors. The Signpost Uncommon also gives you mana of any color. So I always like to cover the cards that are good to splash. I mean, you don't have to be green, red to be splashing, but this is the best color pair for splashing because of those 2 cards. There's some powerful commons and uncommons that if you see them, you probably take them over most cards that are even in your color once you have the fixing. Like Heromancer's Cage, which is an amazing removal spell. Same for Luminous Bonds. Horizon Scholar gives you a nice finisher who scries. Rise from the Grave will be good if you have like a bunch of dragons in your deck. If you don't, it's not really worth splashing. Strangling Spore is a nice removal spell. And Exclusion Mage, a nice, Mana War effect. So what are some of the rares in this color pair? Well, you have Banefire, which is good for you because you can make a lot of mana in this deck. Then you have Demanding Dragon. These dragons are good in any deck, really. It's worth noting. But this deck will be able to play it on turn 4 consistently enough. Lathliss, on the other hand, really is at her best in this deck because you have a common and uncommon dragon. No one else has those. You don't have to rely on the rares, and that means her ability to pump all dragons and put tokens into play is going to come in handy. Sarkhan's Unsealing is one of my favorite cards in the set in general. It seems like such a sweet build around, and this is the place that it's going to be at its best because this deck wants to be ramping into huge creatures, and you can start killing things with Sarkhan's Unsealing, and you can also wipe their board if you play something big enough, though it's not that easy to play a creature spell with power 7 or greater. Spit Flame, this is also, again, the best home for this because, hey, you have dragons. You have 1 dragon at common and 1 at uncommon, so getting it back isn't that hard to do. Vivian's Invocation is good with big creatures, and it costs a lot of mana, so it's good here. Palaka Worm, a great monster to ramp into. Same for Hungering Hydra. And Goreclaw is the last card that really cares about power. All the cards that care about power 4 or greater and stuff like that are in red and green, sort of a sub-theme within the color pair, which makes sense because it's the ramp color pair, but Goreclaw is really good too. Dragon's Horde, again, going to be at its best here because you have access to common and uncommon dragons. There's also a few rares that are worth splashing, really just 2, I guess, and Arcades to a lesser extent, but Palladium Moors, if you can splash it, you should play it, and you'll be able to splash it in this color pair. Palladium Moors is great. Arcades a little less so, but if you have a bunch of dragon synergy, granted all of it's at higher rarity, splashing it is not a terrible idea, but it does only have 1 of your colors, so it's a little dangerous to splash, but it's one you can think about. So our next color pair is Blue-Red, where our Signpost Uncommon is Enigma Drake, who we've seen before. The Drake wants you to be playing instant and sorcery cards because it gets to be ridiculous and huge the more you have in your graveyard. So let's look at the other spell payoffs in this color pair. We, of course, have Enigma Drake. We also have Aven Wind Mage, who has like a pseudo-prowess effect. It gets +1/+1 every time you play a spell. Salvager of Secrets can get you back your spells, which is strong. Double Cast lets you double one of your spells. And Gutter Snipe lets you do damage to your opponent every time you cast an instant or sorcery. So Aven Windmage and Salvager of Secrets both being at common I think is good for this deck. Those are both pretty good payoffs. And, you know, I think obviously Enigma Drake and Gutter Sniper are even better. I don't love double cast, but if you have powerful removal spells, it's certainly good. But the other 4 payoffs are all really good. So let's look at the spells in this color pair, because you want to be playing spells, right? So we've got stuff like Crash Through, which I think is going to be best suited for this deck, because if you have cards that like spells, having a spell that lets you draw a card and gives you sort of a small ability is fine. And I have it here because I don't really think you want to play it in other decks. This is basically the home for it. Electrify, you do want in any deck. Same with Fiery Finish, but they are extra good here. Same with Lightning Strike and Shock. Tormenting Voice is the kind of card, again, that it's fine in any deck, but I think it's going to be at its best here because it draws you more gas, stocks your graveyard, and so forth. Anticipate, same sort of thing. You know, it's sort of spinning your wheels, which most decks may not want to do, but this one does if it has, you know, the payoffs that we were just looking at. Disperse is a nice bounce spell. Sift is a nice draw spell. Uncomfortable Chill is another spell that cycles, although it's not like an incredible one or anything. So blue-red is all about playing instants and sorceries, as we have often seen. It looks like a fun color pair to me. It's usually one of my favorite. There aren't really any rares that are specifically really well suited for blue-red. I mean, there's a lot of good rares in blue and red, but none of them are like spell payoffs or anything like that. Let's move on now to red-white aggro, where a signpost uncommon is Heroic Reinforcements. This is a strong signpost uncommon, and it really pushes you towards doing 2 things, and it makes you do both of those. It does both of those for you, which is awesome. This color pair wants to both be going wide with efficient creatures and creature tokens and pumping the whole team. And guess what? Heroic Reinforcements does both. Why not? It's going to be the kind of card that might end games on turn 4 sometimes. That's how strong of a signpost uncommon it is. So let's look at the ways this color pair can go wide. We, of course, have Heroic Reinforcements, but there's also Goblin Instigator, who brings a Goblin Buddy with him. There's also Militia Bugler, who doesn't actually put a creature token into play immediately or anything. However, it does let you draw a cheap creature from your library, which, you know, is essentially another body. Knightly Valor makes a creature token, and so does Gallant Cavalry. So there aren't a ton of ways of making creature tokens, but the Instigator and the Cavalry are both really good, and they're both common, so those are great. There's also several ways to pump your whole team in this color pair. In addition to Heroic Reinforcements, we have Angel of the Dawn, Inspired Charge, Make a Stand, and Trumpet Blast. So there's plenty of ways to pump your team. I think of these options, Angel of the Dawn is certainly the best. That and your Signpost Uncommon. The other 3 are fine, but they're not nearly as powerful, but they are fine. So in addition to the tokens and pumping your whole team, you need to just have aggressive creatures in your deck too. And so I sort of went through the lower part of the curve of both red and white to show you the potential ways this deck could curve out and be really strong. So you've got Goblin Motivator at 1 in red, Lightning Mares at 2, Viashino Pyromancer is great because it's not only a 2-mana 2/1, but it also does damage to your opponent no matter what. Boggart Brute is a nice efficient creature with evasion. Havoc Devils, basically the same thing. Hostile Minotaur can come out of anywhere and smash for 3. The Inferno Hellion, you know, can do a bunch of damage. I don't love it though. Just because it keeps getting shuffled back into your library. Then in white, we have Leonin and Vanguard, who is sort of a go-wide payoff. It wants you to have as many creatures as possible, as quickly as possible, because it gets bigger. There's also Rustwing Falcon, who, again, I don't love, but if you have enough mass pump, you know, it gets to be pretty decent. Oresco's Swiftclaw has nice stats. I really like Cavalry Drill Master because usually is going to make it so one of your creatures who couldn't attack can. Same thing with Pegasus Courser. He suddenly turns your board into advantageous attacks. And same thing with Starcrowned Stag, who can tap down your opponent's best blockers. So these are the 1 through 4 at common and uncommon in red and white. And as you can see, it's a pretty frightening thing. This deck will, I think, be capable of just ending games quickly. This isn't something we saw at all in Dominaria, really. There wasn't really a color pair who could consistently do this. I think we're going to have it here, and this will be one of those fun police kind of decks that makes sure that you can't just durdle forever and just do silly things. So I think that's a good thing for a format. So what are some rares that are well suited for this format? Well, I think Goblin Trashmaster is nice here. This is probably the best home for goblins because you want to be playing as many low curve creatures as possible. And so, yeah. Lena Selfless Champion is pretty expensive, but she helps you go wide in a way nothing else can. She'll just make your board impossible to defeat, and on top of that, she can make all your creature tokens indestructible. Leonin War Leader is just a great creature who's going to be good in any deck, but it does make you creature tokens, and you know that is something this deck is interested in. So red-white is about going wide, playing efficient creatures, and mass pump spells. Also worth noting, this is a good home for combat tricks and the like as well. So let's move on to our next color pair, which is green-white. Here our signpost uncommon is Satyr Enchanter. His name and everything is a reference to enchantresses, which are an old group of cards that drew you a card every time you play an enchantment, and that's what he does too. That's pretty nice because, especially with auras, because auras have huge downsides in that you end up sort of really putting yourself in a really swingy situation where if your opponent kills your creature, you get 2 for 1, and if they don't, you probably win the game. But he makes it so that 2 for 1 isn't quite as crippling because he drew you a card. So what are the other enchantment payoffs in green-white? Well, this is it. So you got Satyr Enchanter, Druid of Horns, and Novice Knight, which are the only real enchantment payoffs. Vinemare I have here because this deck wants to play auras. Novice Knight is also pushing you towards playing auras, as is Druid of Horns. So all 3 of these want you to play auras. Satyr Enchanter is more general, but all 3 of these want you to play auras. And Vinemare and Druid of Horns and Satyr Enchanter all do a good job of sort of counteracting the problems that auras have. So if you have them, they make sure that you can hold on to card advantage despite playing auras. Vinemare because they can't kill it. Druid of Horns because it gives you a beast token, and Satyr Enchanter because it draws you a card. And the Novice Knight, to a lesser extent, it makes it so it can attack. So what are some auras in this set, that common and uncommon? Well, you've got Knight's Pledge, Knightly Valor, which I actually like a lot. People always underrate this card every time we've seen it, and it always overperforms. This is the 3rd printing of it, and it's been good every time. You've also got Talons of Wildwood, which I think could get particularly insane with Satyr Enchanter because you can just keep bringing it back and recasting it. And it already, on its own, gets around the downside of auras because you can just keep bringing it back. Not that it can do it efficiently, but it can do it. It's a good place to put your mana in the late game if you don't have anywhere else to put it. Oaken Form, gives a nice boost, but I don't love it. And Blanchwood Armor almost makes you be mono green. So I think Knight's Pledge, Knightly Valor, and Talons of Wildwood are the 3 best of the auras, with Knightly Valor being the best. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also protect your creatures. That's one way to keep the downsides of auras from happening, and I think these 2 cards kind of do that for you. Aegis of the Heavens makes it so a damage spell isn't really going to do anything, and Make a Stand makes all your creatures indestructible. So what are some rares for this color pair? Well, I like Remorseful Cleric just because it's a good place to put an aura, and Prodigious Growth obviously is an insane aura and the best thing ever to put on your Vinemare. Overall, I think the green-white deck is going to have, sort of like we saw with red-black, there's not quite enough synergy, and I also don't really advise going full-blown enchantments and auras because it can be really dangerous for you. But there's some synergies that make it a sort of a sub-theme within the color pair, and sometimes you'll end up with 3 Satyr Enchanters, and all your Luminous Bonds are going to draw you a card, and stuff like that will be pretty insane. But I think most of the time it's just sort of a green-white creature deck that has some aura synergies going on. So that is green-white. Let's move to our next color pair, which is black-white. So black-white signpost uncommon is Regal Bloodlord. He wants you to gain life. That's what he wants you to do, and if you do that for him, he'll make you a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying every single turn. So what are the other life payoffs? Obviously there's Regal Bloodlord, but there's also a Johnny's Pridemate, which is kind of insane. It can quickly snowball to being pretty impossible to deal with because it gets so big so quickly. Epicure of Blood, which hurts your opponent every time you gain life. And Nightmare's Thirst, which the more life you gain, the more things it can kill. I think that both the Thirst, the Pridemate, and the Bloodlord are all really, 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 really strong payoffs for gaining life. And, if you can get, a few copies, even if you just have 1 each of those, that's a good reason to be gaining life because they're all just going to take over games. And if you can get more, it's going to be even sweeter. The Epicure is fine too, but he's not in the same class as the other 3 are. So what are some of the ways that black-white has to gain life? Well, there is a Johnny's Welcome, which gains you life every time you play a creature. Daybreak Chaplain, which has lifelink. Dwarven Priest, which gains you more life the more creatures you have in play. Herald of Faith, which is just a great attacker who gains you life. Invoke the Divine, which can destroy artifacts and enchantments and gain you life. Leonin Vanguard, who I think is going to probably be better in the red-white deck, but it does happen to gain you life. Revitalize, this is basically the only place you'll play this, and I think you only play it if you end up with a ton of life gain synergy. But, something to keep in mind. Shieldmare, another nice card that gains you life, just when it comes into play and when it gets targeted. Another lifelinker in Child of Night. Lich's Caress, everyone's going to want to play it, but it does gain you life. Skymarch Bloodletter gains you some life in addition to being a good attacker. Vampire Neonate is a repeatable source of gaining life. So for some of these cards that just ask you to gain life every turn, he's a nice one. Vampire Sovereign, another great card that happens to gain life. This is a good place for Fountain of Renewal too, because it's another repeatable source of life gain. So it will really fuel cards like a Johnny's Pridemate and things like that. So what are some rares for this color pair? Well, we've got Resplendent Angel and Leonin War Leader. The War Leader, of course, makes you tokens, but they have lifelink. And Resplendent Angel is like the ultimate life gain payoff in that if you're gaining 4 more life a turn, you get to create Sarah Angels. She can, of course, just pump herself and give herself lifelink and also be gaining you life on top of everything else, which is pretty great. So Black-White is a life gain deck. It looks like a lot of fun. Let's move now to the next color pair, which is Blue-Black. Our blue-black signpost uncommon is Psychic Symbiont, and it doesn't really hit you over the head with what you should be doing in this color pair the way some of the others do. You know, like play enchantments, play artifacts, gain some life. No, this is just like a classic blue-black control kind of card. Blue-black wants to be grinding the game out and getting card advantage, and Psychic Symbiont lets you do that. It gives you some nice card advantage. It gives you a 3-for-1 in an ideal situation because your opponent loses a card, you draw a card, and you have a 3/3 flyer that they have to deal with one way or another, usually by spending a card. So, you know, Psychic Symbiont really wants you to be playing a control deck where it can help you close out the game, both by being a big flyer and by shutting down, you know, removing a removal spell from your opponent's hand and drawing you a card. So what you need for a blue-black control deck to succeed is a lot of removal, a lot of ways to interact with your opponent's creatures, and you need some win conditions. So there's a lot of removal in this set in blue and black. We've already seen Lich's Caress. We haven't seen Murder yet. Obviously, it's good in any deck, but this deck really wants the removal more than most. Strangling Spores, Disperse, not exactly removal, but it does bounce a creature, and it's a nice tempo. Dwindle is a nice little removal spell. Exclusion Mage, another bounce. Totally Lost does the Time Ebb thing. So those are the kind of removal you have at common and uncommon. It's a lot. You also want to be generating card advantage because over the course of this game, while you're sort of stalling, the way you're going to win is by just having more cards than your opponent. And the ways you get that are with things like our friend Psychic Symbiont, but also Bone to Ash, which is a built-in 2-for-1. You counter a creature spell and draw a card. So get rid of one of their cards with one of your cards, and you get to draw a card. So that's what makes it a 2-for-1. Omen Speaker is a nice little blocker early, and it doesn't technically grant you pure card advantage, but Scry 2 is pretty close to drawing a card. You've also got Sift, which lets you cast in one card to basically net 2. Got Blood Divination, which draws you 3. Fell Spectre is another 2-for-1 who also pays you off for having other ways to make your opponent discard cards. You know, it just gives you some nice card advantage. Gravedigger, always a 2-for-1 basically, because it brings stuff back from your graveyard while being a 2/2 itself. Same with Salvager of Secrets, except it's instants or sorceries. So these are the kind of cards that will really make the blue-black deck just grind out wins by making your opponent discard cards, by getting cards back from your graveyard, by straight up drawing cards. You're just going to be able to win the long game. So how does this deck win at common and uncommon? Well, I think there are 4 cards that can really serve that role. Departed Deckhand can make any of your creatures unblockable, basically, and that's a good way to win the game. Itself is unblockable, too. Frilled Sea Serpent, don't love it, right? But hey, if you need a win condition and you don't have one, you could do worse. Horizon Scholar and Vampire Sovereign are also really good. Scrying 2 is great on a big creature with flying already because it makes it so you know you're going to draw more gas. And Vampire Sovereign also gives you value even if it dies, and the life gain is relevant. So what are some rares that are well suited for this deck? Well, I think Liliana's Contract is going to be good here because it draws you 4 cards for only 1 card. You do lose 4 life, but I think it's probably worth it. Graveyard Marshal, you know, it's a grindy card that can win you a long game. It's going to be good in any black deck, to be fair. Same with Bone Dragon. It'll win you a long game. Good in any deck. Again, pretty much the same with Djinn of Wishes. You also have Mystic Archaeologist, which is just a 2-mana 2/1, but in the late game turns into a card advantage engine and that can single-handedly win you the game. Patient Rebuilding, if there's any deck that can win with milling, it's probably this one because of how slow it can go. And Patient Rebuilding actually also draws you cards. And Windreader Sphinx is a nice finisher. You're going to be playing a lot of flyers anyway, so drawing cards is a pretty good deal. All right, so let's move on to the next color pair, which is black-green. Our signpost uncommon there is Poison Tip Archer, which provides you with a 2/3 that has reach and death touch, which is great. And whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So this color pair seems to me to perhaps be the most loosely defined of all of them. There's not like a lot of, like, you can sort of be a sacrifice deck. You can take the elements of the black-red sacrifice deck that are in black and do some sacrificing. Making your opponent lose life with that is good. But it also just sort of feels like a color pair that just sort of wants to grind out a win. But I kind of feel like they didn't really get there on the synergy here. I think most of the time Black Green's just going to be a good stuff deck. I put Graveyard here because I sort of feel like it's sort of pushing you in that direction, between the Poison Tip Archer draining your opponent every time you have a creature die, and between several cards in this set in both black and green that get you back cards from your graveyard. But there's not really enough for it to be a deck on its own. And I think Poison Tip Archer's main strength is just in being a 4-mana 2/3 with Reach and Death Touch. So what are some of the ways this color pair has to get stuff back from the graveyard? Well, you've got Gravedigger, of course. Got Macabre Waltz. You have Reassembling Skeleton. You have Rise from the Grave. You've got Talons of Wildwood, which can keep coming back, and Recollect. So there are several ways to get things out of your graveyard, but the problem I see is there aren't enough ways to stock your graveyard. Really, the only card you have is Stitcher's Supplier, and that's it. It can stock your graveyard really effectively, and no one else is really going to want it, so maybe getting a couple of them is a reasonable thing to think will happen, and it will be pretty good in this deck because it has basically the most ways to get things back from your graveyard. But on the whole, I don't think you can really consistently think you're going to have a black-green deck that's going to be using the graveyard as a value engine. There are a couple rares that are good here. Liliana can mill you, but she's also terrible unless you have zombies, so your deck also needs to have zombies for her to be any good. Bone Dragon obviously is just a nuts, insane card, but it's one of the few cards in the set that really wants you to have a bunch of cards in your graveyard. So Bone Dragon becomes good in a deck that wants stuff in its graveyard. So that's black-green. Feels to me like the least synergistic of all of the color pairs, but that doesn't mean it's going to be bad. It just means it's not, doesn't really have a hard theme. It's sort of just a good stuff deck. Let's move now to blue-green, where our signpost uncommon is Skyrider Patrol. This thing is a really, really good card. It's hard to see what exactly this color pair is trying to do. I had to really look through all the cards in these colors and try to find a common theme, because Skyrider Patrol, you're like, okay, maybe it's a +1/+1 counter deck. It's not. There aren't any other +1/+1 counters in this set. Maybe it's a flying deck, and that's sort of kind of what it is, but green obviously doesn't have any flyers. In the end, Skyrider Patrol's ability to make something have flying until end of turn and make it bigger is great. What I think this color pair is trying to do, and it's interesting because it's not something we've ever really seen before, is I think it's sort of like a Blue-White Skies deck, but there aren't any green creatures with flying, except that Skyrider Patrol can give things flying, and that there are various ways in both color pairs to make creatures evasive, whether that's making them unblockable, whether that's they have trample, whether they have any of these abilities. They're just hard to block. This color pair is basically about evasiveness. It's about having creatures that are difficult to block, and ideally you're making big green creatures difficult to block but usually by using blue cards. So let's go ahead and look at the other sort of ways of granting evasiveness in addition to our friend Skyrider Patrol. For example, you have Ether Tunnel, which gives a creature unblockable and +1/+0. You also have our friend Departed Deckhand, who can give anything, make anything unblockable, basically. There are very few spirits in this set, so 99% of the time will be unblockable. Even Wind Mage already has flying, of course. Aviation Pioneer makes a flyer. Snapping Drake has flying. Horizon Scholar has flying. Frilled Sea Serpent can make itself unblockable. Talons of Wildwood gives creatures trample, which is a form of evasiveness. Europer Guide can make some of your opponent's creatures unable to block every turn. Bristling Boar makes blocking more difficult on your opponent. Colossal Dreadmaw has trample. And there's also our friend Vinemare. I have it here mostly because it's like the best place to put an Ether Tunnel. There are going to be games in this format where you play a Vinemare and then you play an Ether Tunnel on it and it's just over. Like, that's going to happen. I mean, that's a 6/4 unblockable. Game over, basically. So blue-green is a weird color pair. I think it's sort of a good stuff color pair too, but it does have a lot of ways of making it hard for your opponent to block. And I think that's sort of a cool thing we see going on here with blue-green. Overall, this set looks like a lot of fun to me. Core set 2019 looks like a good set. I think we're going to go back to the basic fundamentals of Limited here. You're not going to have crazy grindy decks be almost the only thing people play, which is what we had Dominaria, which I loved. But there's legit aggressive decks in this format, and I'm looking forward to this new set. I'll be posting draft videos of it, I think, about a week after this video goes up, something like that. So Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. And don't forget to subscribe for future Core Set 2019 limited content.